Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. So today I'm gonna be setting up my new journal for 2025. I actually got a new journal and wanted to try a different brand this year. While I do love Arch and Olive, I came across this journal from Notebook Therapy just because I was looking for a new journal and I really love the design, so I just decided to get it. It has this maple leaf and moon design on the cover, which is really pretty, and it also has a really soft linen texture. I was actually a bit surprised that it's so soft, and then it also has these gold edges with some more maple leaf details and also some more details just on the back and the side, which I thought was really cute. The pages are really nice and flat because of the stitch binding, which is always very important to me, and then the dot grid is just the usual 0.5mm size. It also has an elastic band in the back as well as a pocket and also 2 bookmarks, which I think is pretty standard, and then they also include a little paper clip, which I think is really cute. I decided to get the original size, which is a little bit smaller than the usual A5, so here's a comparison between the two. And of course I will leave all of the details in the description in case you're curious. And this journal also only has 128 pages, but because I don't like to include that many spreads, I thought I would just try it out. Before getting started, I always just like to put some washi tapes underneath the left side so that it's a bit easier to write on, and then I just went ahead and wrote my name on the first page. For my yearly setup, I always like to go for something pretty neutral so that it works for all of the seasons. So this year I picked out a few orangey tones, a light beige and a muted blue, and then I will also use this dark brown Pentel brush pen, which I ended up really loving because it's not quite black, but I think black would also work really well. I decided to make a big cover page on the first 2 pages, and I didn't include a key this year just because I already know which symbols I like to use, so I just left it out. And in case you're new to bullet journaling, a key is basically just a section where you define which symbols you want to use for different purposes. So for example, I tend to use a square for important tasks, a circle for less important ones, a dot for notes, and so on. But you can also go ahead and check out the original bullet journal video by the inventor Ryder Carroll, where he goes into a lot more detail, so I'll leave a link in the description in case you're curious. Anyway, for this cover page I wanted to make a really simple design, so I went for these kind of wavy lines in the background, and I alternated between the 4 colors that I chose for this setup. I tried to make them pretty even, and I also tried to draw them in one go just because the color gets a bit darker when you go over them more than once, but I also corrected any streaks with a bit of white here and there later on. I decided to add some different shapes in the bottom 2 corners and then also along the top, and of course the shorter ones are a little bit easier to manage, but I think overall they turned out pretty good. A few tips I have for making it a bit easier is, of course, first of all, sketching them before you draw them, and also trying to keep the distance between the lines the same, and then lastly also turning your journal whichever way it makes it easier or sort of more comfortable for you to draw the lines. I think everybody has a certain preference, and for me it's just always easier to draw the lines from the top to bottom and left to right, so I try to just rotate my journal so that the angle is a bit nicer for my wrist. If the lines are a little bit too long, you can also just break them up into more sections, but overall I would just say take your time with them and have fun. Now that the background is finished, I wanted to write 2025 in pretty big letters on top, and I used the dark brown Pentel brush pen, mainly just because I didn't have a black brush pen that wasn't half empty, but I ended up really loving the dark brown with the other colors. I really took my time with sketching the outlines for the numbers, and I also used the dot grid as a reference to make sure the 2s are as even as possible. I do want to mention that I have a lot of experience with typography just because I studied graphic design and we had to do a lot of calligraphy practice with nibs and ink, so please don't feel bad if you haven't had a lot of practice. And if you don't feel confident enough to draw the numbers yourself, you could also just go on Pinterest and find a serif font you like and just print it out instead. Again, I made sure to go really slow. This clip is sped up by 200%, so it's twice as fast as in reality. And the dot grid also really helps to have a bit of a guide, so I just used it to make sure the numbers start and end around the same point on the top and bottom, so that they don't look like they're different sizes. I also colored in the thicker strokes, and I went in the same sort of direction because the dark brown is not super opaque, so you can still see the brush strokes, but you could also go over them again if your paper can handle it. This journal, just like the ones from Art and Olive, has 160 GSM paper, which is really thick, so it can handle a lot more color than thinner paper. When I was sketching the numbers, I also made sure that they are evenly spaced across the page, so I just counted the dot grids in between the numbers and also on the outside and the inside edges of the paper. As you can see, I tried to make the outlines in one stroke as far as it was possible, but you could also make them in smaller increments if that feels more comfortable to you. Since the brush pen has a flexible tip, you can make really thick and really thin lines just by changing the amount of pressure you use. And what I found is that usually having a thicker stroke makes it a lot easier to make a really even line instead of using a really thin fine liner, so I would definitely recommend using a marker or a brush pen like this one. Of course, you can always just go over your lines a second time to make sure they're nice and even, or you can also correct any mistakes with a white gel pen. I would recommend using one that's really opaque so that it really covers up your mistakes. And I did have to use one this time as well because I ended up smudging the color a bit on the bottom of the 5. Anyway, I was super happy with how this cover page turned out, so let's move on to the next page. Overall, I didn't want to include a lot of different spreads just because I usually don't end up filling them out, and also because this journal has a lot fewer pages than my usual ones, so I didn't want to waste any space with spreads that I won't be using, so this time I just included the most essential ones for me personally. This next spread is an overview of the whole year, so I'm writing down each month and all of the dates. I first colored in the background for the weekdays, alternating between the 4 colors, and since this journal is a little bit smaller, there are also not as many grid spaces, but actually not a lot fewer, so for reference, the Art and Olive A5 has 26 by 38 spaces, and this one has 24 by 35 spaces on one page. Anyway, the sections are 7 spaces wide as well as tall, and I left 1 space empty in between the sections, both horizontally and vertically. I wrote the months on the top and then the weekdays on the backgrounds with the dark brown again, and then I just wrote down all of the dates with my black Pilot Juice pen, which is always the most tedious part, but I just referenced my phone calendar and took my time so that I don't make any mistakes. March and June do need 1 more row for the last day, but I just wrote it in the space I left empty, and I think it's not very noticeable that way. The next page is going to be dedicated to my goals for this year as well as my weekly reset, and I wanted to make a sort of border with the wavy lines again, so I just used some washi tape to cover up some of the edges to make them look nice and clean. Then I went in with the colors in the same order as on the cover page, and I just made some more wavy lines in the top left and the bottom right corner to sort of frame the middle of the page nicely. If you wanted to, you could also make this across 2 pages to include a lot more detailed goals or other sections that you want to include, but again, I just wanted to keep everything pretty compact and simple, so I just did it on 1 page. After the first section was done, I just peeled off the washi tape, and now I have a nice clean edge. Then I just repeated that same process on the bottom right. In case you're in the mood for a cozy painting session, I recently posted a video where I painted this scene from Kiki's delivery service, so I'll leave a link in the description, or you can just click the card in the top right. And thank you so much if you do end up watching it. I was actually super happy with how it came out, but for some reason the YouTube algorithm didn't really like me posting something different than my usual videos. Anyway, then I just peeled off the tape again, and then for my goals I first just made a title on the top with the same brown brush pen to keep everything consistent, and then I also added 2 lines on the sides just to make a bit of a border. Next, I split my goals into 4 categories and I wrote them down on the top. So the first category is personal growth, the second one is financial goals, the third is physical, so anything health and fitness related, and then lastly career goals. Underneath each header, I wrote down a few goals for this year. So for the first category, I wrote down practicing 3D because that's something I'm really passionate about. And then also making more paintings because I really want to get back into it. And I will probably make a lot more videos about it in the future, so stay tuned for those. Next, for financial goals, I want to track my spending and also be very mindful about what I'm spending my money on. For my physical goals, I want to work out at least 1 to 2 times per week, do my stretches daily, and also get some fresh air whenever I can. And then lastly, for my career goals, I want to keep making content on YouTube, but also get my first full-time job, and then also work on my Etsy shop, which I've been neglecting a little bit this year. Underneath, I wanted to add a list for my weekly reset that I can reference because I sometimes kind of forget what is really helpful for me to do each week so that I can feel really prepared and organized for the next week. So first I just made another title, and then again I split my reset tasks into 4 categories. So the first category is anything related to planning and organizing. So again I just made some small headers, and then I wrote down a list underneath. So for the first category, I wrote down making my weekly spreads, planning for the next week, checking my habits, which I tend to forget sometimes during the week, and then lastly, updating my notes app, which I use a lot on my phone. Next up is self-care, which I think is really important because I think sometimes we just tend to forget to take care of ourselves as well. So I wrote down doing a face mask, reading a book or listening to an audiobook, doing a cozy gaming session, and also doing some yoga or a stretching session. The third category is my digital reset, so here I wrote down going through my photos so that I don't hold on to any unnecessary stuff in my gallery, deleting any old files from my computer, also going through my emails and deleting anything I don't need, which I think I'm actually pretty good at, and lastly also deleting my old notes because again I use them a lot and they tend to get a bit cluttered. The last category is cleaning, so anything to kind of reset my room. So I wrote down changing my bed sheets, vacuuming my room, doing the laundry, and then also just tidying up any other clutter. And that is it for these 2 pages, and let's move on to the next spread, which will be the last one for the setup. First, I wanted to make another grid spacing guide, and if you've watched some other bullet journaling videos before, you might have seen something like this already. So a grid spacing guide is basically where you count all of the grid spaces, and then you write down how you can split a page into half, thirds, quarters, and so on, so that you don't have to think about it every time you create a spread. Some people just write it down on a page and then reference it throughout the year, which is what I used to do in the beginning. And I think last year is where I first got the idea from another channel to make these sort of rulers that you put into your journal and then you can just take them out whenever you need them. So I first just made a little title on the top left side and I wrote down 2025 Grid Spacing Guide. Then I cut out 2 rectangles from an old journal, and I had already measured out how large they would have to be, and then I also rounded off the corners with this little tool. I kind of forgot where I bought it, to be honest, but you can just search for a corner rounder tool and you should be able to find something like this. Then I started with the shorter one and I just numbered the dot grid from 1 to 22 because I always leave some space empty on the outside and the inside of a page anyway, so I just made it a bit shorter. Next, I used those 4 colors again to make some lines to split this page into halves, thirds, and then I also added 2 more lines where I split it into 7 columns because I tend to use that a lot for my habit tracker. And then also one for a smaller scale with 7 columns because I use that a lot for my mini calendars. But now that I'm actually thinking about it, I'm not sure if I will use it again in this journal. But you can of course include any sort of columns that might be useful to you. I think there probably isn't a right way for everyone, and it also might not make a lot of sense to you, but this is just what has worked for me so far. Then I also just wrote down how many spaces are in between each increment so that I don't have to count them again. Next, I repeated those same steps for the long ruler, but I wrote everything right side up this time so that it's easier to read when I actually use it. For this one, I split the page into halves, thirds, and then quarters, which I mainly just use for my weekly spreads, and then I also included another line where I split the page into 2 sections vertically, but I leave some more space on the bottom, which is another layout I like to use for my weekly spreads, which you can see in the top, and I hope that makes sense. Basically, whenever I want to make a weekly spread, I think about what kind of a layout I want to make. So for example, if I want to create 8 equal sections for in each page, I just take out both of the rulers and then I use the short one to mark the width of each section and then a long one for the vertical axis. And that way I just don't have to count out the grid spaces or even think about how wide or long I have to make them so that they're even. I really hope that makes sense, but of course if you have any questions, leave a comment down below and I will try my best to answer them. To secure them on the page, I bought these photo corners and I just kind of stuck them in place so that I can take them out easily, but they also don't fall out of my journal. Here I'm just trying to demonstrate how you use them, but again, if you have any questions, leave them down below. The last page I wanted to include is a space for my themes of 2025, which I also included last year, and it was just really fun to fill them in every month. And so I split the page into 12 sections again, just like for the yearly overview, but I left 2 spaces empty in between the sections vertically this time just because I wanted a bit more white space. I used the same 4 shades to color in the background for the titles, and then I made the sections in black, and I also left 1 space underneath the titles. I didn't include a larger title on the top just so that there's a bit more space for the themes, but I don't think it's really necessary and I think it ended up looking really nice and clean this way. The black boxes are 7 spaces wide and 5 spaces tall, and again I left 1 space empty in between them horizontally. Lastly, I just wrote down the months again with the dark brown brush pen, and I went for a bit more of a loopy lettering style to also differentiate it from the yearly overview since the layout is quite similar. To make sure that the titles are centered, I left 2 spaces empty on both sides, and then I tried to fit each letter into one of the 3 grid spaces in the middle. Each month when I have finished making my setup, I will just go back to this page and make a little doodle with the theme so that I can look back and see all of my themes from that year in one space. Anyway, that is it for this setup. I know there's probably a lot fewer pages than you've seen in other videos, but I think for me these are the most essential ones and I'm super happy with how they turned out. So I hope you could get some inspiration and I hope you enjoyed this video. Making a setup for the new year has always been super exciting for me, but I think this year I also want to focus on making a lot more painting content and maybe also some little crafts like working with air dry clay. So if that's something you're interested in, make sure to subscribe to my channel. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching as always, and I hope I'll see you next time. Bye!